On the frontier, we learned to fear three things: bad men, bad luck, and bad weather. Bad men you can shoot, bad luck you can outwork. But when the weather turns on you, you do what it says, or it buries your name beneath the snow. That winter, the woodpile ran out the same day the wolves came down from the ridgeline. And by the time the storm found our cabin, there were only 3 of us left to face it: a mother, a boy, and a little girl whose breath had started to sound like paper tearing in the dark. They named that stretch of mountain the Muttering Pines, on account of how the wind threaded through the long needles and made it sound like the timber was whispering. Our cabin sat crooked on the edge of a hollow where drifts gathered like thoughts too heavy to say out loud. The widow Martha Hale lived there, if lived is the word for it, slept light, worked hard, and counted every stick of wood as though each one had a heartbeat she could not waste. Her son Samuel had just turned 12, big enough to hold an axe, small enough that the axe still felt like a taller man's truth. Lily was 8. She'd caught a chest cold 2 weeks earlier, the kind that nestles down in the ribs and clings. When the early storm rode in like a white-muzzled stallion, it kicked their world to pieces. Martha had miscounted. She'd planned for another week of wood, but the cold sharpened and ate through the woodpile like a dog through bone. The last armful burned too fast, tongues of flame licking the iron belly of the stove, greedy and bright, the way hungry has a shine to it. "Samuel," she said, "fetch the short saw. We'll see what windfalls near the tree line. Only fallen limbs. We don't swing at standing trees this frozen. Split wrong, the blade'll kick and take a finger." He looked at the door. The cracks around it glowed with pale light from the snow outside. "Wolves been seen, Ma. Wolves been here longer than us," she said, "and they don't care for people with axes." She said it light, but she shouldered the rifle and checked the chamber. Click. The sound was the same as a prayer in that house, a small piece of certainty in a world that no longer promised any. Lily coughed, wet and mean. Martha glanced at the stove, then at the wood box. Empty. The way a grave is empty before you carry a man to it. They tied scarves and stepped into the storm. The pines leaned and hissed. Samuel's breath came in little ghosts that fled his mouth and were swallowed by the white. He was brave in the way boys are, afraid, but moving anyway. Martha walked ahead, the rifle crooked in her elbow, her eyes cutting the drift lines for anything black against the purity of it. They found fallen limbs fat with resin, half buried in snow. They worked them free, slow and careful, the way you free your hand from a trap. Samuel sawed, teeth chattering with more than effort. Martha split pieces with small, sharp strokes, like she was editing the world down to what could burn. The wolves kept to the tree line, shadows that moved with purpose. They watched. They were not in a hurry. Hunger rarely is. After an hour that felt like a day, they dragged what they had to the cabin. Lily's face looked thinner than the morning. The fire took the new wood like a starving body swallows broth, shivering toward warmth. By nightfall, the storm broke its restraint. Snow came on sideways, a white wall pushing. The wind gathered itself into a voice and spoke through the eaves as if to say, "Lie down, give in, become quiet like the others." The old cabin groaned back, nails complaining in their holes. Martha counted what remained in the wood box and did not like the number. "Tomorrow," she said to Samuel, "we try for the dead oak down by the wash. It holds dry in its heartwood. If we can split it." Samuel nodded, lips split from cold. He didn't ask what if we can't, because the question was already in the room, sitting in a chair. No one had offered it. That night, Lily's fever rose. She talked in fragments, something about a red ribbon and a pie cooling on a windowsill, There was 2 summers and a lifetime gone. Martha bathed her face with a rag dipped in snowmelt warmed on the stove. The warmth dipped out of the rag almost as fast as hope dipped out of a person when the numbers are wrong. Later, when the last stick in the box knocked its ash against iron, like an old man tapping his pipe empty, someone knocked on the door. Martha froze. Samuel's hand went to the rifle stock. The wolves rose in her mind, but wolves do not knock. Men do. "Who's there?" she called. The voice that came back sounded broken in, like a pair of boots that had walked too many miles. "Name's Ezra Pike," it said, breathless between words, "and I am frostbit to the bone. If you let me in, I'll not trouble you long." She waited. Trouble has ways of getting in, even when you lock every bolt. Then Lily coughed again, and Martha opened the door. Ezra Pike looked like a map of bad roads, mid-40s, beard with ice in it, a coat that had been new when Grant was. He stood there swaying, holding something wrapped in burlap, an axe head with a haft worn by work. His hands were bleeding where the cold had taken the first taxes from them. He saw the child. He saw the thin fire, and his face did something soft that didn't match the hard lines in it. "May I warm my bones a minute?" he said. Martha led him to the stove. Samuel kept the rifle angled, careful but ready, like holding a question you might yet have to ask louder. Ezra put his hands toward the stove. He didn't push to the pot on the hob. He didn't look at the larder. He just stood and shook as the heat argued its way back into him. "You came through the wash?" Martha asked. He nodded. "Lost the trail 6 miles back. Would have laid down if I hadn't seen the smoke from your chimney. I figured I'd borrow an hour of your fire and pay it back in wood." "Pay it back in wood?" Martha said, flat. He lifted the burlap. A good axe, honest steel. "I can swing," he said, "and I can listen. You tell me what you need swung at, I'll oblige." Martha looked at Lily, then at the way the stove light ran thin across the floorboards. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow at dawn, dead oak by the wash." Ezra nodded once, then collapsed into the chair like he'd been shot. He slept with his hat still on, jaw working like he chewed an old piece of grief in his dreams. Martha sat in the other chair with the rifle in her lap, the way the moon sits with the cold. She did not sleep. Dawn came out of the storm like a bruise, yellow in the places it should have been white. The wind had spent itself some, but the cold had not. Cold does not spend, it collects. Ezra woke early, as men do who once had reason to. He stood, winced at his hands, wrapped them in strips of clean cloth Martha offered without ceremony, then shouldered the axe. "You sure you can swing with those?" Samuel asked. Ezra tested the weight. "Pain's just a bell," he said. "It rings to let you know you're still the one standing." They went down to the wash. The dead oak hunched there like a preacher who'd said too many funerals. Ezra tested the grain. "Dry heartwood," he said. "Split right, this'll burn long." He set his boots, brought the axe up, and let it fall. There are men who chop at wood like they are punishing it. Ezra split with a craftsman's patience, understanding the tree and the winter, and the stove they all served. Chips flew. Steam rose from his breath and from the raw, living muscle of the wood. Samuel hauled split rounds to the sled, grunting with the pleasure of useful work. Martha watched the tree line. The wolves watched the woman. Halfway through the trunk, a sound rolled down the ridge. Low, animal, mean. Not wolves. Something bigger and less patient. A cat, maybe a cougar, stretched thin by hunger. The forest went quiet in the way that says something is listening to you. Ezra's eyes slid toward the sound, then back to the cut. "We finished the wedge," he said, voice very calm. "Then we go." They finished the wedge. On the way back to the cabin, the cougar shadowed them at a distance, a suggestion of tawny movement against a blank scripture of snow. Ezra did not turn his back to it. He walked sideways, steady, like he was talking to the mountain with his eyes. When they reached the cabin, the cat peeled off. It was not the day for that trouble, not yet. They loaded the new wood into the box. The stove took it like a king takes tribute, without thanks but with consequences. Lily slept deeper. Martha's shoulders fell a fraction of an inch. Samuel smiled with his eyes for the first time in days. "Payment enough?" Ezra asked. Martha looked at the stacked wood. "For the hour we lent you," she said, "but we'll be in debt by sundown again." Ezra nodded. "Then I'll keep the account." They worked, day into night, night into day, the way Winter is an accountant who never gets tired. Ezra spoke little. When he did, it was practical. Where the wind fell trees, how the creek iced in layers you could read, how to bank a stove at night so the coals held like a secret. He showed Samuel the knot that holds a sled on an incline, and the way to turn your heel on ice so you don't go down with your hands full. Martha watched him with the wary kindness people keep for strangers who've bought the first round and might buy the next 3, or might take the place apart with a smile. She asked him nothing about where he'd come from. He offered nothing. That third night, with wood stacked high enough to be called a promise, the wolves came in close. The first howl spiraled through the pines like a prayer someone had turned inside out. The second answered from below the ridge. The third was closer than it should have been. Samuel's eyes were big. "They smell Lily. They smell warm," Ezra said. "They smell meat." "Then Samuel began. Ezra shook his head. "We do not open the door to shoot shadows," he said quietly. "You open to shoot one, the others come in on your breath." The howls became a ring, then a noose. Claws scratched against the wall, measured, testing. Ezra set a kettle on the stove, then lifted it with a strip of cloth and poured boiling water onto the doorstep. Then another pot on the back sill. Steam rose aggressive into the night. The wolves, disliking the hiss and sudden heat, retreated a pace. Ezra did it again. A simple thing. But winter is a war of simple things done on time. "Where'd you learn that?" Martha asked. "From a man who knew the names of small problems before they got big," he said. Later, when the wolves settled back to watch, Ezra turned to find Samuel studying him. "You a lawman?" the boy asked. "Not anymore," Ezra said. "You an outlaw?" Ezra smiled with one side of his mouth. "Not anymore," he said again. "Mostly I'm a man who carries his debts in a place he can feel them." Martha caught the way he said that, the weight in it, like he'd named a direction he couldn't change. The next day, the coldest yet, the kind that makes a nailhead smoky if you breathe on it, Ezra suggested the old pine snag above the wash. "It split in lightning years ago," he said. "The seams are still dry. We can get 3 days' burn if the wind doesn't turn us into a story." They went. The air had teeth. The snow had opinions. They worked with their breath coming short. Ezra's hands bled through the cloth, then stopped bleeding, which is the sort of mercy winter offers, too late to be called kindness. They loaded the sled. The sky thickened. That's when the men came. 3 of them, riding slow out of the timber, hard hats, hard eyes, hard luck written all over their coats. The kind of men who smell when a place is thin and press a thumb there to see if anything gives. "Morning," the lead rider said. He wore a brass watch chain with no watch hooked to it. "Storm's a poor time to be away from home." Martha's shoulders squared. Ezra did not reach for the axe. He did not reach for the rifle. He let his hands hang open the way a man does when he's counting pieces on a board most folks can't see. "Good morning," Martha said. "Neighborly to share a fire," the rider said, smiling without humor. Our camp ran low on wood. We'd oblige you to hand that sled over. Won't oblige, Martha said. The rider's hand drifted slow toward his belt. Ezra spoke then, mild as water. You can have the sled, he said, if you can take it from the boy. Samuel looked at Ezra, surprised, then back at the men. He put a hand on the sled rope. He didn't let go. The rider frowned, something like embarrassment shading his eyes. He hadn't expected to feel anything. He got off his horse anyway and stepped toward the boy, like a man stepping toward a dog he meant to kick. Ezra moved faster than the cold should allow. He did not go for his axe. He went for the rope. He lifted it, swung it, and in that one whip-crack motion, he snapped it hard against the man's wrist. The man yelped, and the pistol clattered into the snow with a sound only winter makes, a small, ringing finality. Saddles, Ezra said softly. Mount up. The other two had been smiling. They weren't smiling now. Something in Ezra's voice cut across the three of them the way a crosswind shaves a ridge. The lead man started to bluster. You don't. But Martha had brought the rifle up smooth, not at anyone, just high enough to settle the argument inside their heads. The wolves watched from the tree line, having seen similar plays end badly for the loud. Mount up, Ezra repeated. They mounted. Pride is heavy, but cold makes a man choose what can be carried. They rode off with the brittle laughter of men promising themselves they'd tell that story differently in town. When the three were gone, Martha put the rifle down. Samuel blew out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Ezra retied the rope with a knot he'd taught the boy, the movement clean and quick. On the way back to the cabin, Samuel asked, Why didn't you just take the gun? Ezra looked at the snow where the pistol had fallen, leaving a dark, shallow bowl the wind had already started to fill. Guns break the quiet, he said. Sometimes quiet is the only thing we own. That night, Lily woke clear-eyed for the first time in days. Her fever had stepped back a pace. Winter is a wheel. Sometimes it rolls away from you before it rolls back over you. Martha fed her a broth made of almost nothing and all her love. Lily smiled, fell asleep with her hand hooked in her mother's sleeve, the way a fish hooks itself to the shore. By the stove, Ezra rewrapped his hands. The skin looked like old paper on new bone. You've done us more good than a stranger owes, Martha said finally. But you're not just passing through. You're passing us somewhere. Why this way? Ezra looked into the stove door the way people look into church windows they're not sure they're allowed to open. South Fork of the Shiloh, he said. A boy I owed a debt to lived there. Thought I'd put my boots on his porch and pay it. I was 3 winters late already. Shiloh? Samuel said. That's 20 miles east. Not that Shiloh, Ezra said, smiling sadly. Another one. Another war. Long time back. A man pulled me out from under a wagon when the guns were still shaking the dirt. He said if I ever walked the world again, I'd remember his name. Caleb Hale. The room changed shape around those 2 words. Martha's hands went completely still. The house had accepted the name as if it had been waiting with an open palm. My husband, she said. Not a question. Ezra nodded once. He told me about you, Martha said, voice very small. Said he'd dragged a man out of hell, and that hell had tried to take him back through the hole he made. He came home thin. Sat nights without speaking. Woke up with his hands closed like he was still holding on to someone. Ezra swallowed something heavy. He did not let go, he said. Martha's eyes shone, but she did not blink. He died in a spring flood 5 years later. A horse went stupid on a slick rock and rolled him under. It wasn't fair, Ezra Pike. The war didn't get him. The weather did. Ezra nodded, and something in him unclenched. I carried his name a while, he said. It was heavy. I thought to set it down where it belonged. I suppose I've done that now, in a crooked way." They sat quiet, with the stove making the talk the living can't. Later, when the house had found the shape of that truth, the wind changed. It blew from the north with purpose. The temperature fell like a trap, the kind of cold that makes the glass inside your lamp tremble. Ezra stood. "We need more wood," he said softly. "More than we have. The storm's going to sit on us like a fat man on a weak chair." Martha looked at him. "You can't swing much more with those hands." "Hands are just the argument," he said. "We need the wind." They hit the wash before dawn, working by the pale light of a sky that didn't love them. They were beyond tired now. They were a kind of machine made of hunger and will. They split, they hauled, they stacked. And when the wolves came in, Ezra didn't turn to them. He spoke to them without looking up. "Not today," he said, almost kindly. "Not this house." Maybe they heard it in him. Maybe they heard it in the axe. They kept their distance. By noon, the storm arrived full. The world that had been a set of distances they could walk became a wall they could not. Ezra went out one more time for the stack he'd hidden under an overhang last week. He tied the sled rope around his waist, pulled his coat tight, and winked at Lily like he'd borrowed someone else's brightness for a second. "How long?" Martha asked. "An hour," he said, "if the wind is honest." "When is wind honest?" she asked. He smiled with just his eyes. "When it kills you clean." He went into the white. 1 hour became 2. The light fell and rose and fell inside the storm, like somebody picking up and setting down a lantern behind a wall. Martha banked the stove as he'd taught her. She rationed the wood in handfuls that felt like betrayal. She prayed in a language that had no words, only pictures. Her husband at the river, her boy with the axe, her girl's breath moving in and out, and a stranger walking uphill into a God who did not love men the way they'd been told. Samuel pressed his face to the window until the ice pattern kissed his skin. Then the rope snapped tight across the threshold. Ezra fell into the room backward, dragging the sled in with him. The rope had bled his waist raw. He lay there laughing the laugh of a man who has outlived his appointment just this once. "Wind was almost honest," he said, teeth chattering. Martha hauled the sled clear, slammed the door, and put her hand to his cheek. It was wood cold. She poured whiskey into him. He coughed, sputtered, recovered, and pushed himself up on one elbow. "Next time I take the downwind route," he said. "There isn't a downwind route," she said, not smiling. "I know," he said, and smiled anyway. Night arrived like a verdict. The storm built its case on the roof, evidence piling loud and heavier. Inside, the stove worked as hard as an animal works under a bad master. Wood dropped fast, too fast. Ezra watched the stack go down, measured it against the wind, measured that against Lily's breathing. He stood. "I'll bank the drift on the north wall," he said. "Cut the wind on that side. Might buy us a stick or two. Not in this," Martha said. "You'll..." He pulled his coat. Sometimes the math writes itself in a man's face, and the result is a number you do not argue with. Martha stepped aside and hated the part of herself that did. Ezra opened the door. The wind reached for him like an old friend with bad intentions. He leaned against it and disappeared into the noise. Martha fed the fire. Samuel sat with the rifle across his knees, eyes on the latch as if the wind might lift it like a thief. The wolves found their courage. They came to the door and pawed, low and relentless. The way it sounds when hunger takes its hat off and sits down. Martha lifted the kettle, poured another hiss of water across the sill. She shouted once, a raw sound, not at the wolves, but at the cold that had taken too many things that did not belong to it. The wind answered with a sustained note that ran through the rafters and into the bones of everyone who owned those bones. Minutes slid into an hour that felt like a winter by itself. Lily's breath stuttered, caught, returned. Martha held the small girl against her chest, tried to give her warmth with the shape of her own body, the way a person tries to stop a river with their hands. Then the wolves stopped scratching. In the quiet, they heard it, a sharp, deliberate rhythm on the far side of the house. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. Not claws, not wind, a shovel. Samuel went to the back window. Frost had made the glass blind. He scraped a porthole with the edge of a spoon. He peered out and made a sound that was almost a sob and almost relief. "Ma," he said, "he's digging us out." Ezra had tied himself to the chimney stack with a rope and was cutting a trench along the north wall so the drift would fall away from the house instead of into it. He moved like a man who'd memorized the instructions of his own pain and decided to ignore them. Every few minutes he'd stop and slap his hands against his chest, the way a soldier drums life back into a limb. Martha wanted to scream at him to stop. She didn't. Sometimes love is the thing that keeps quiet when shouting would be cruel. He finished the trench. He stood a minute to breathe and look at the sky that had no face. Then he turned and saw them. 3 dark shapes down by the wash. Horses, men. The same ones from the day before, or close enough that it didn't matter. Winter makes people mean. Hunger makes them stupid. Desperation makes them brave. They had come back for the wood and anything else not nailed down. Ezra looked at the door. He looked at the wolves, the ring of them, pressed low against the snow, eyes like coins. He looked at the rope around his waist. He smiled into the wind, the kind of smile people wear when they've come to the last page and see their own name written there in the same hand as their father's. He unhitched from the chimney and looped the rope around the sled. He stepped into the open and shouted at the wolves, a low throat sound, a challenge. Then he ran. The wolves followed the rope. The men followed the wolves. The storm swallowed them all. Inside, Martha heard only the wind and the sudden empty quiet at the door. Quiet is a kind of information. She waited. She counted to 100 100 times. She banked the stove. She fed Lily a spoon of sweetness, save for a moment when the world asked too much. An hour, 2. No knock came. No boot step. Only the wind losing interest as the night wore on. When dawn came, it came like it always does, shy about having to clean up what dark left behind. Martha opened the door. The trench Ezra dug held. The drift fell away like a defeated argument. The footprints at the threshold were a story written in a hand the wind had not erased yet. They followed them 20 paces, then 30, to the place where the wolves had circled. There was blood, yes, but not enough to mean a life had been collected. There were the marks of a sled rope cutting a groove into the snow. There were the hoof prints of 3 horses going every way but straight. And there, near a felled pine, was Ezra Pike's axe. The handle was wrapped fresh, the head burned clean, as if someone had heated it and wiped it with oil. On the haft, stamped small as truth, was a mark Martha recognized only because Caleb had once carved the same one into the bedroom beam when Lily was born. Hail. She picked up the axe. It fit her hand like a sentence you finally learn how to say. They listened. The mountains said nothing back. The wolves had moved on. The men had moved on. The storm had moved on. Only the cold stayed, the way the past stays, making a house bigger and smaller at the same time. Martha carried the axe inside and set it by the stove. Lily slept with color in her cheeks for the first time in a week. Samuel stood very straight and did not speak. Martha touched his hair, and then she did cry at last. quietly enough that she could still hear the stove purr and the house remember itself. By afternoon, the sun showed its face. Weak, but it showed it. The wood pile, built with Ezra's hands, looked like a congregation kneeling. That night, Martha told Samuel a story. The true kind. The kind with fewer miracles than you want, but enough to live on. She told him about a man in a different winter and a different war, who had pulled another man out from under a wagon and said, "If you walk this world again, remember my name." She told him about debt and how sometimes it could be paid, not in coin, but in steps through a storm with a rope biting your waist. Samuel asked, "Will he come back?" Martha looked at the axe by the stove. She looked at the door. "If he does," she said, "we'll have a fire for him." Outside, the pines muttered their old secrets. The wind went to whispering instead of shouting, and the wolves, sated or tired of trying, sang their thin songs for each other and not for the house. Martha banked the stove the way Ezra had taught her. Coals pulled forward, greenest wood set slow on top so the heat would sit and think for a while. She stood there a moment with her hand on the iron, feeling the small animal of warmth purring against her palm. Then, very softly, she said the only benediction she had left. "Not all angels have wings," she whispered. "Some carry axes,